Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. I'm in front of a computer today, not the bookshelves, which means it's either a data or an image heavy video that I've got for you today. I decided that I was going to kind of combine the two of them and look at some of my stats, but particularly the really good end of it. So I'm going to go through a ranking, not quite a tier listing, but a ranking of all of the books that I've given 5 stars to over the last 10 years. Okay then, so before I get into the actual rankings, let's have a look at some quick ground rules. So first of all, I've been using a weighted rating system for about 10 years now, and most of this data is taken from that. Over the last, I don't know how many years, I've started using half stars in that. So if there are any books that you've seen me rate on Goodreads, for instance, as 5 stars, that do not come up in here, there are a couple of reasons for that. One, it was because I've given it 4.5 stars, but I've upgraded it to a 5 on Goodreads, because of course they still do not believe that half stars exist for people. Or it's because it's from over 10 years ago. So there are some titles on here that you won't have seen me mention on the channel because they're from before I started my channel up, and or because I've not included them on my spreadsheet, because there are some sci-fi titles, for instance, that I read whilst I was in a fantasy slump a few years ago that did not get recorded as weighted ratings. But outside of that, I've got 39 titles that I've given 5 stars to over the last 10 years. And I say 10 years, I'm going by year, not by month. So it's anything from 2013 to present day. There are a couple that I rated literally like 10 years and 2 months ago, but I'm still including those because they were only just outside the 10-year window that I'm looking at, and I think it was literally just 2 titles that applies to. So I've got 4 brackets, 4 categories that I'm going to put these books into, and I'm going to explain them a little bit out of order. So in third, the third highest, I've got a solid 5 star. These are the ones that are really deserving of a 5 star rating. I just had a really great time with them, and I still think of them fondly. Below that, we've got today 4. These are the ones that I might not still think of as a 5 star book. So I always give my star rating shortly after finishing a book, and I will always stick to that rating. I won't go back and change it months later when I've decided that my feelings on the book have changed. But with these ones, I've got a selection of books that I did initially rate as 5 stars when I finished reading them, but if I look back at them now, maybe I wouldn't have gone for 5 stars, maybe it would have been 4 or even 4.5. Then going to the top end of the scale, we've got excellent. So these are the 5 star books that are definitely 5 star, but they're just a touch above the solid 5 stars. So the ones that really stand out in my memory. And then right at the top, we've got the creme de la creme, the absolute stunners, the 10 stars out of 5 kind of books, ones that I really loved. So I'm going to go through these in chronological order as per the date that I read them. So we're going to start off with those couple of titles that were just outside of the actual 10-year window. And the first of those, back in March 2013, was Night Watch, a book of a Discworld by Terry Pratchett. I really had a good time with this one. I do admit I've gone off Terry Pratchett's work, I've gone off Discworld. It's not the sort of humour that I currently enjoy, but in my past years, I used to have a really good time with Discworld. I've read a lot of them. Most of the Discworld, in fact, is in my library, and I just really loved them as something else. Although it's not really something for me recently, I did still enjoy Night Watch, and I do have fond memories of it. It's got a really good story that I've very much enjoyed, and I think this one is still deserving of 5 stars. It's, for me, a solid 5 star read. Next up, we've got A Memory of Light, Wheel of Time Book 13 by Robert Jordan, co-written of course by Brandon Sanderson after Jordan passed away. This was also from March 2013, and I would say The Wheel of Time has one of those almost love or hate kind of reputations. People either really like or really don't like it. I'm in the really like it class, and I think if you're reading the 14th book of the series, you fall into one of 3 categories. One, you are a little bit strange in my opinion, and you're reading it without having read all the previous books. 2, you're a hate reader, you don't want to read it, you're not enjoying it, but you're forcing yourself to, largely because you want the views and you want the drama, around a rant rating. I've literally seen people say that they do that. And then third category is a category I fall into, which is the group of people who have overall enjoyed the series and they're continuing because they're invested and they want to get to the end of it. Now, if like me you fall into that category, chances are that you're really going to enjoy the last book of a series because you know what to expect and it's the culmination of everything you've gone through. And normally for me, I love a real good ending that pulls everything together, and I think that's what you got here in A Memory of Light. So I will put this one in excellent. It's just a touch above a solid 5-star read for me. Next up on my list from August 2013 is Theft of Swords Rhaenyra Revelations Book 1 or Bind Up 1 by Michael J. Sullivan. This is one of my favourite series. I really loved my introduction to Royce and Hadrian and then following through their stories. So this was an easy 5-star for me for the entire series actually, all three of the bind-ups, duologies, whatever you want to call them, that make up what you generally see as the Rhaenyra Revelations trilogy. But this one I just really enjoyed. I think it's a good solid 5-star read still. Next up we move into The Faithful and the Fallen, and there's no malice on this list because I actually did give it 4 stars. It wasn't quite 5-star, but every book in this series or this world that I've read from John Gwynne after Malice, I did rate it 5 stars. So spoiler alert if you're not already looking at the screen. So with Valorous Book 2 in the series, I really started to build my love for The Faithful and the Fallen and the Banished Lands as an overall world when you include the follow-up trilogy of Blood and Bone as well. I would say this one's a solid 5-star. It's the author's second book. He still had a bit of finding his feet to do, still had a bit of building up the characters and the world and so forth. So although I really enjoyed it, it wasn't the best of the books, but it was still definitely worthy of a 5-star rating. Next up, I'm moving to another of my favourite series, Shadows of Yapt by Adrian Tchaikovsky, and this one is book 9, War Master's Gate, which I read in September of 2014. And again, this is a bit like what I was saying with Wheel of Time. You've gone through so many books in this series, you're really invested by the time you get to 9 and 10, the final book of the series, that it would be a bit odd. It would have to be probably quite a disappointment to not have a 4 or a 5-star at that point, or at least I would hope so. Adrian Tchaikovsky with Shadows of Yapt did not let me down, and I really enjoyed all of the books in the series. They were just so inventive, so creative. I loved the world and the characters as individual characters, but also the type of characters they were, the different insect kingdom that made up these characters. For me, I would say War Master's Gate is another one that still highly merits its 5-star rating. I would say it's a solid 5-star because it's just a really solid read. Next up in October 2014, I read Bloodsong, Book 1 of Raven Shadow by Anthony Ryan. Now, this is a series that I've DNF'd. I can't even remember if I finished the second book in the series. I definitely didn't move on to the third book, so I just wasn't having a good time with it. But the first book in the series, Bloodsong, was really excellent. I don't know what it was about it that made it so much better than the second book in the series, but they were just absolutely worlds apart. I don't remember too much in the specifics of this one. With a lot of these books, they are so long ago, so many books that I've read in between them all kind of blur together, but I really do remember enjoying the storyline. I don't normally enjoy the kind of military or magical school setting, but even though we had a bit of that here, I like the way it was handled, and I like the trials that the characters go on to kind of progress through that and to graduate essentially. And overall, I thought it was a really good book that still stands up, and for me it's yet another solid 5-star read. In December 2014, I went back to the Shadows of Yapt and finished it off with book 10, Seal of a Worm. And I really enjoyed this one. It's, as I say, the culmination of a big long series that I really enjoyed. Every book was excellent for me because I just really loved the inventiveness of it. And with everything pulling together and giving us a good satisfactory ending to the series, in my opinion, that just tips this one over and sets it on a higher pedestal than just a solid read. I thought this one was an excellent 5-star read. Sticking with favourites, and we're back to Rhaenyra Revelations. I read book 2, Rise of Empire, in April 2015, and again I really enjoyed it. Every book in this series is on this list today because I just had a really great time with it. This is another one that I put into the solid 5-star category because although the series is one of my absolute favourites, I love the characters, I love the banter, I love the adventures that Royce and Hadrian get up to. I think the series as a whole was a solid 5-star read, which is very difficult for a series in its entirety. But these first 2 books, where we're still building our knowledge of the world and the characters, at least for me, not at that point having read any of the earlier books in the chronology of this world, I think the first 2 books were both really solid 5-star reads, really at the high end of that scale though, almost tipping over into the excellent category. And then in August 2015, I read book 3 of The Faithful and the Fallen, Ruin by John Gwynne, and I absolutely loved this one. I really had a great time with it. Ruin for me is one of those top books that stands head and shoulders above all the others, so it's going in, obviously, creme de la creme. And then in December of 2015, I went back to Rhaenyra Revelations and finished it off with book 3, the third of the bind-ups that make up this series, and this one was Heir of Novron. And again, I've said it before, I do tend to appreciate books. I like them more the deeper we get into a series, so it's no surprise that this one I found to be a bit better than the previous 2. I've already said that the previous 2 were very close to the excellent category, and that's exactly where this one lands up. It's an excellent 5-star read that just sits a cut above the others. In March 2016, I read The Deed of Paxenarion by Elizabeth Moon. This is a bind-up, it's a trilogy, but in the chronology of the series, it is technically books 3, 4 and 5. I really had a great time with this one. I absolutely flew through it, even though it's 1200 pages for the bind-up of these 3 books that I have got, but I really had a good time with it. It's maybe a bit of a cheat because it is an omnibus edition, so it's 3 books in one, and I'm rating it as 1 book because that's the volume that I read, but I really enjoyed this one. I've spoken about it on a couple of my videos as a book that I really recommend, and I would like to go back to this world at some point and read some of the other books in Paxenarion's story. Today I would say I still have very fond memories of reading this book, but I did kind of blitz through it and everything's a bit of a blur for me. I remember bits and pieces, but not too many real solid details of it. Only that I had a really good time, and I've got a vague recollection of the overall story that Pax goes on. So this one I'm going to put into today a 4, maybe I would give it 4.5, maybe a flat 4-star rating, but I definitely enjoyed it enough to give it 5 stars at the time. Then we go to December 2016, and around that time book 4 in The Faithful and the Fallen came out. So this is Wrath by John Gwynne, and like Ruin, I absolutely loved this one. Those are the 2 books that often cause me a bit of conflict when people ask me what is my favourite book that I've read, because sometimes I will say Ruin, sometimes I will say Wrath. They are both right up there for me as the best books that I've read, so obviously this one is going in la creme de la creme. Then I went into a bit of a reading slump, and I didn't read too much over the next couple of years, but especially fantasy, I think I maybe did burn myself out a bit. But at that time I was saved, and my reading for pleasure was definitely saved by Star Wars, and I started to move into sci-fi a little bit. But I picked up the Star Wars books to continue with my knowledge of the world and the characters after I watched the Clone Wars and Rebels series. And I do have a couple of books coming up that I haven't mentioned on any of my videos because I didn't rate these on my weighted rating, so they're not included in my Hall of Fame. But one that I really enjoyed was Dark Disciple by Christie Gold, and this one continues the story of the Clone Wars. It's based on some episodes of the Clone Wars series that were never actually produced. So if that series hadn't been cancelled when Disney took over the Star Wars franchise, you would likely have seen this story on the screen instead of just in the book form. But I really had a good time with following the stories of Quinlan Vos and Asajj Ventress, and it was just a real great time for me. I would say if I looked back at it today, I might not give it 5 stars, so I'm going to put it in that today a 4 category. But I still definitely had a great time with this one, and it was 5 stars when I finished reading it. During that slump, I did pick up one of my favourite authors because the first book of Blood and Bone came out by John Gwynne. This was A Time of Dread. So I read that one in February 2018 and of course gave it 5 stars because by this point, even though we'd moved forward a few centuries from the story of the Faithful and the Fallen, I was invested in the world, the characters, the lore, and I loved John Gwynne's storytelling. This one was a great kind of reintroduction, if you like, to that overall world. I absolutely loved it. I'm going to put this one in the excellent category because I think it is just head and shoulders above the solid 5-star books. That was one of the only fantasy books that I read for a good couple of years, but in August 2019 I went back to sci-fi and I picked up Leviathan Wakes by James S.A. Corey, book 1 of The Expanse. I can't remember if I had watched the TV show at that point. I think I had, so I knew kind of what to expect from this. I did give the book 5 stars at the time. I don't think I would now, partly because I think it was just very different to the other books, and especially now having read nearly 3 more books in that series because I'm close to finishing book 4, and I think that they are so much better than Leviathan Wakes. But of course I've moved on a bit from Leviathan Wakes as well. There's a few years and lots of books in between, so I'm not as close to it. I think it's a very good book, but if I'm to look at it now and to compare it to some of the books in the series that I've rated below 5 stars, I would still say that they are better than Leviathan Wakes, and so this one goes into the bottom category today. It's 4 stars. And then the month after I read that, in September 2019, I was back to Star Wars. I went through a load of the new canon Star Wars books around this time, and I really enjoyed Alphabet Squadron, book 1 of a series of, I think it's the same name, by Alexander Freed. I just loved reading stories set in the Star Wars universe with all of these things that I recognised, but they were away from the kind of Skywalker saga of the films, and I think that really helped a number of these books. So you got 5 really interesting, very different characters, all in different ships that all have a letter designation. So you've got your X-Wing, Y-Wing, U-Wing, A-Wing, and B-Wing, and I like that they are all very different ships, like they have very different pilots, and it was just a really interesting story for me. I enjoyed the second book as well. Haven't gone back to the third book yet, but I do hope to do that at some point. But for this one, I am going to go with the today it's a 4-star read. I really enjoyed it, but I just don't think it quite stands up on the same kind of level as some of the books that I have rated and would still rate 5 stars. When I got back into my fantasy vibe, I went back to John Gwynne because I'd left it a while before finishing this series. So I read back to back the 2 remaining books in of Blood and Bone. So in March 2021, I read both A Time of Blood and A Time of Courage. So A Time of Blood, I again really enjoyed. It was a great reintroduction to the world after I'd been out of it for a couple of years during my fantasy slump, but I really loved it, and it really helped to kickstart my fantasy kind of vibe again, essentially. So I really like it for that as well. This one I'm going to put into excellent because I think it really was. It wasn't quite in that top level, but it was pretty close to it for me. And then, of course, I moved straight on from that to A Time of Courage. And this one brought everything to a close in a way that I absolutely loved. It had highs, it had not lows, but kind of low points emotionally, where you were really sad because of some of the things that were happening. And of course, a book that can make you feel that whole kind of roller coaster of emotion and still have you coming out on top, really enjoying it, I think is a really good thing. This one for me is one of the creme de la creme. I absolutely love the author's work, and you can see that by the way that 3 of his books have made it into this absolute top category. They are just a cut above. In June 2021, I was reading Greatcoats. I read 3 of these books back to back. I really loved the series by Sebastian de Castell, but it was book 3, Saint's Blood, that I liked the most, and it was the only one of the series that I rated individually as 5 stars. I really had a great time with it. I just love the characters. It's a bit like Rhaenyra Revelations with Royce and Hadrian. You've got here Falkio, Brasti and Kest, and I love the interaction that they had with their other kind of side characters in there as well. I just thought it was a really interesting story, really well done with some real emotion in there. I think these books did a great job at digging into the emotions and making you feel as you were reading this. I would say it's a solid 5-star. It's close to being in that excellent category, but it's definitely 5 stars. November 2021 was one of my greatest reading months, I would say. I had 3 5-star reads back to back. The first of those was Illborn by Daniel T. Jackson, and this was really interesting, and I had a great time reading it. I think this one was an excellent debut, and obviously it's therefore a first book in a series, and to have so many people praise it so highly, it's quite a rare thing, and it sets the bar so high for the next book in the series. But I think Illborn was an excellent read, and we'll hear more about this series later on. Next, I read Of Blood and Fire Book 1 in The Bound and the Broken by Ryan Cahill, and this was again a great book. I did read the full prior to this, which didn't quite get 5 stars for me. It was a little bit maybe disjointed the way it had the 4 storylines and kind of jumped in between them because it was only 90 I think pages, but I still had a great time with that and just carried straight on into Of Blood and Fire. The only difference really was it's 400 years later, so everything had slowed down at first, at least, before things picked up and just carried on building as the book went on. It was a great book, a great opening to a series. I'm going to put it in a solid 5-star because it did have a few little issues with it. Not that I really minded, but it just doesn't quite move into that next category up. With the second book in the series, though, Ryan really knocked it out of the park. This one was Of Darkness and Light, and I absolutely loved this one. It's one of my favourite second book in a series of all time. It just did such a good job. Everything about this was excellent. I don't really have a bad word to say about it, so there's no surprise when I'm putting it in the top category. Of Darkness and Light is just one of those titles that is very difficult to best. In January 2022 then, I read We Are the Dead, Book 1 of The Last War by Mike Shackle, and this one was just like a breath of fresh air for me. I absolutely loved this one. It had such great themes of rebellion and kind of the underground kind of fight back, and I loved seeing all the different levels of it and the way that all the main characters were fighting together but not together. They all wanted the same thing, but they wanted it in different ways, or they didn't realise that the other players were trying to get the same thing as well. So it ended up with them kind of fighting against each other or working against each other almost. But it was a great book. I've really had a good time with this series from what I've read so far. I've got one more book to go, but this one definitely for me sits above the regular, if you want to call them such, 5-star reads. I'm going to put this one in the excellent category. Then in February 2022, and it really doesn't feel like it was that long ago, I've got Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir. I really had a great time with this, and I remember so much of it because everything worked really well. It had great audio, it had great humour, it had great science in there that was really accessible. It's one of the books that, for the amount of time in between me reading it and where I am now, I can remember so much of it, so many details. That obviously is a good thing because it really sticks in my head. So this one I would say is probably the best sci-fi book that I have read. I've read a number of really good sci-fi books, but this one just had that extra oomph about it, and I'm going to put it in the top category, creme de la creme. March 2022 was another good month with 3 5-star rated books. I read the Darkwater Legacy Book 1 by Chris Wooding, which was The Ember Blade, and again I did this one on audiobook, and that really heightened my enjoyment of it because I really loved the narration and some of the voices for individual characters, especially Grub. I just think he was a really great character, but the audio brought him to life in a way that you couldn't do for yourself reading it. And I had a good time overall with this one. It did have a few slower points, a few kind of lower points, but I still think it was an excellent but so I'm going to put it in that second category. It's just a little bit better than a solid 5-star read. Then I picked up a novella, and this is a rarity for me giving a 5-star rating to a novella, but I do have, I think, 3 on this list. Now, novellas being a lot shorter, you can't get as much into them, as much development as you can a novel, so you can't really compare, or at least I can't and won't compare them to novels in the same way. It's a bit like your apples and oranges comparison, but this one was the Citrine Key book 0.5, if you like. It was a prequel novella to the Dragon Spirit series by L.L. McRae, and I had a great introduction to that world, which really ramped up when I read the next book as well. I'm going to say this is a solid 5-star read because it's a little bit restricted by the page count in what can actually go into it, but it did a fantastic job within that page count. It's one of the best novellas I've read. You might call it the best novella I've read, but we'll touch on that later on. For the page count though, it's got so much bite and I really enjoyed it. Next up, I read the first book in the series proper, which was The Iron Crown, and it just continued from there. My enjoyment, my love for this world. I like how you had obviously more time to develop characters and world and setting and the storyline itself. You could see so much more, and I really enjoyed it. I can't wait to read book 2 in this series, and I'm sure it's going to find itself in a 5-star category as well. This one though, I'm going to move it a step above the rest of the 5-star ratings. It was an excellent book for me, not quite in that top category, but it's one of the highest rated books, I would say, in this excellent category. So going back to novellas, in April 2022 I read The Exile by Ryan Cahill, and again this one was absolutely phenomenal for what it is. It's again kind of unfair, where I was just saying with the Citrine Key you can't really compare novellas to novels. It's almost the same. It's very difficult to compare The Exile to the Citrine Key because it's pretty much twice the size. I'm not sure exactly on the respective page counts of both of them, but it is practically a short novel rather than a novella, so it's kind of an unfair comparison. But I had a great time with it. Ryan did a fantastic job of building up a backstory for this important character, Dane, and I think it just worked really well. It had some gut punches in there with some real emotion towards the end of it, and I just had a great overall time with it. I'm going to put this one in the excellent category, so where I say the Citrine Key is maybe the best novella I've read, that would depend on how you classify The Exile, I suppose. If you call it a novella, it is just slightly ahead of the Citrine Key, or if you call it a short book, then of course the Citrine Key I would say is the best novella I've read. In May 2022 I read, or listened to in fact, the second book in the Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson. This is Words of Radiance. I actually listened to this one on graphic audio, which absolutely heightened my enjoyment of it. I said with a title earlier on, and there's a couple I could have said it for, that the audiobook, the narration, can really elevate a book and give it a higher rating, sometimes a much higher rating than it might have normally got. That's definitely the case here, although I would say it's a very good book, of course, in its own right. But the audio experience with a whole cast of voice actors and sound effects and music as well was just really fantastic for me. I had such a great time with it. I would really want to do the same with book 3 and 4 and the rest when they come out, if they're available on graphic audio. Haven't got to them yet, but I'm sure I'm going to have a really good time with them. For Words of Radiance though, I'm going to put it in that excellent category because it was just a step above a solid 5-star read. And then in the same month, May 2022, I read book 1 of The War Eternal by Rob J. Hayes. This one was Along the Razor's Edge, and everything I've just said about Words of Radiance, minus the graphic audio elements of it, can be said here for Along the Razor's Edge. The audio was absolutely fantastic. I have heard people say this, and I'm sure for me it would be very difficult if I listened to another audiobook narrated by Moira Quirk. I will just be hearing her as Esker because she embodies this character for me. She is Esker, and what she brings to the narration really has for me made this potentially a much better series than it otherwise would be. I'm enjoying the series, but I think the narration is a big factor in that. Saying that though, book one, Along the Razor's Edge, was not necessarily unique, but it was very different. It was very kind of brave. I really had a good time with the story, the introduction to the world, the characters, the magic. And I'm going to put this one in the excellent category because it doesn't deserve to be called a solid 5 stars. It's more than that. In July 2022, I had another 3 5-star reads, but these ones I don't feel quite as good about for the most part. So we're going to start off with Dragon Mage, book 1 of Rivenworld by M.L. Spencer, and this one I really did have a good time with, but it did have its moments, it did have its kind of highs and lows. I did struggle, I wasn't sure whether to call it a 4 or maybe a 4.5 or a 5-star rating. So because of that, and because of the way that I look back at it now and I remember it well and I have my highlights that I look to, I do also remember some bits that I wasn't quite as fond of. So this one I'm going to call a 4-star for today. Maybe again it would be a 4.5 star, but today it's not quite a 5-star rating for me, it's a 4. And then we've got my SBFB 08 finalist, LA Books Fire of the Forebears, book 1 of Heritor's Helm. I really did like this. It was a really, again, not quite unique, but a very different world that I really enjoyed reading about. I love is it the Saja or the Noskaina, the talking animals that you had in there, and I just think it was all really well done. I didn't have any of the real issues that people have spoken about when they're reviewing it, either for SBFBO or because they've seen it as part of SBFBO. A lot of people have been not quite on board with the characters. They think the writing or the dialogue is a bit clunky. I enjoyed it so much I just flew through it and I didn't have any of those issues. I am going to put it in the today a 4 category because I don't think it's quite on the level of some of the other titles that I've spoken about today, but it's still one that I have very fond memories of, and definitely it was a 5-star rating when I read it because I had such a good time in that world. And then also that month I read Bonds of Chaos by Zach Argyle. This is book 3 in Threadlight, and I read it in a day because I was so engrossed. I loved the overall story of Threadlight and I wanted to get to the end of it because I was invested and I wanted to know what happened. Although of course that can be sad as well because once you get to the end of a really good series, there's no more of it. But this one, as I say, I burnt through it in a day. I felt really tired afterwards, but I just didn't want to put it down. And of course, it's got to be a 5-star rating. You're not going to do that for a book that's not 5 stars. I'm going to call it a solid 5-star. It was actually my favourite book of 2022 because I had such a good time with it. But I'm not sure how much of that is also kind of a combined element, bringing in Voice of War and Stones of Light into that kind of rating, and they maybe bump up the score that I have for Bonds of Chaos slightly overall. So it's definitely still a 5-star, but I don't think it's quite in my excellent range. So then we move to October 22 and the third of the novellas that I've got on this list, and this is Strangers in the Promised Land by Jim Wilburn, book 1.5 if you like of his Continua Chronicle. I had a great time with this, of course I did, that's why I gave it 5 stars, but I just love that he took 2 of the characters who were kind of side characters in the first book of the series for 7th Cadence, and he really built on them. So I liked those characters, so I was really happy to have this kind of reintroduction and to see more of them, to delve deeper into them as characters whilst continuing their story. For today, I'm going to put it in the 4-star category. I think maybe a 4.5 would have been right, but again, like some of the others, I just don't think it quite sits on the same level as those in the solid 5-star category. Then in November 2022, I read Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldry, and this is a very different book for me, but I think I just picked it up at the right time and I had a really good time with it. I definitely enjoyed it, and yes, I probably will be looking to read that second book when it's available as well, because it was just something very different, even if it's not something that would sound like it would be my thing. I did give it a 5-star rating at the time, but again, I'm going to put it in the today a 4 category because I think it's just slightly below, and I would imagine a large part of that reasoning is because it's not my usual thing, so it is maybe a bit more difficult for me to give it a direct comparison to my 5-star kind of level. Also in November, just a few days after I finished Legends and Lattes, I finished listening to The Written by Bengali, book 1 of his Emaneska series, and this is another one of those where a really good book was elevated by a great audio. I just really got along with Stephen Cree, I think it is, with the narration that he gave this book, and I'm looking forward to listening to some more in this world with this narrator. I think this is one that maybe would have landed in that 4-star category if it wasn't for that elevation from the narration, so I'm pleased that I had that, but I did have a great time overall with this book, and I'm going to call it a solid 5 stars. In December 2022, I rounded out the year with another 5-star read, which was Blood of the Spear by Mark Timoney, book 1 of The Eye of Eternity, and this is one that really did what I love the most about fantasy today. It took the old school kind of classic fantasy values and brought them up to date with a modern style of writing. I love it when an author can do that well, and Mark Timoney did it very well here. This one was one of my favourite books of the year, just beaten out by Bonds of Chaos, but I think it sits very close to Bonds of Chaos on that list, and I'm going to put it in that solid 5-star category as a result. This one is maybe one of the highest in this category, just pushing for a spot in that list of excellent 5-star titles, but I'm going to keep it in solid 5 stars. And then we move into 2023, and I read Age All Sin as my first 5-star read of the year. This is book 2 of the Ilborn saga by Daniel T. Jackson, and this one was just incredible for me. It was high octane pretty much from start to finish. A big chunky book of 700 to 800 pages, and I flew through it in next to no time comparatively because it was just so fast paced, really intense all the way through. I loved every bit of this. There wasn't really, for a book with 4 main characters, 4 main story arcs if you like, that did a bit of overlapping, there wasn't really anything that kind of fell down below a real 5-star level for me, so that is very, very difficult. This is going to be one of my favourite books of 2023, if not my number 1 book of the year, so I'm definitely going to put this in that top category. This one is, so far for 2023 at least, creme de la creme. And then the last 5-star read I had was The Shadow Casket by Chris Wooding. This is book 2 in the Darkwater Legacy, and this one was very, very similar to the Ember Blade. It had a lot of the same kind of highs, a lot of the same kind of not quite so highs, but I'm going to put this one in the category below. It's a solid 5-star read because I do remember really struggling to rate this at the time. Do I give it 5? Do I give it a 4.5? But I did land on 5 stars, and I'm going to do the same today, but it's no higher than that. I did have a great time with it. There were some great character developments in here. I did listen to half of the book. I was reading it at first as an arc, and then when the book was released, I still hadn't finished it, so I switched over to the audio because I enjoyed the Ember Blade audio so much, and that definitely helped my enjoyment. Would I have moved it up a category if I'd have listened to the whole thing? I don't know, possibly. I just feel like the Ember Blade was really good, and this one had a lot of the same kind of things, a lot of very similar elements to the storyline, and I would have preferred to see a bit more invention with it. So I'm going to call this one a solid 5 stars because it definitely is. Alright, so some new titles that I've not really spoken about and some that I've not spoken about at all on my channel, but that's my listing of all of the 5-star books that I've read in the last 10 years. I hope you found this informative. I hope that you've picked up some titles in here that you've maybe not thought of before, or maybe this has helped push you over the edge to go and pick it up and see if you agree with my rating. If you've read these titles, let me know down below. Did you give it 5 stars as well? Do you agree with where I've put it within my rating of 5-star books today? I'll hopefully catch you in the next video sometime soon, but until then, as always, take care of yourselves, read some good books. Bye for now.